Look, I am sorry Sony, but you've made 3 bad live-action Spider-Man spin-off movies in a row, and now you're making yet another one? How exactly are you going to convince people, let alone Spider-Man fans, to go and see this one? Oh. Hello everyone and welcome to Rewind Reviews. Well, we're taking a look at Madam Web. Released in 2024 and based on the characters appearing in Marvel Comics, Madam Web tells the origin story of Cassandra Webb, a New York metropolis paramedic who begins to demonstrate signs of clairvoyance. Forced to challenge revelations about her former, Cassandra has to safeguard 3 young women from a deadly adversary who wants them destroyed. The movie was directed and co-written by S.J. Clarkson, alongside Matt Sazama, Burke Sharpless, Claire Parker and Kerem Sanger as screenwriters, with performances from Dakota Johnson, Sydney Sweeney, Isabella Merced, Celeste O'Connor, Tahar Rahim, Emma Roberts, Mike Epps and Adam Scott. Now this may come as a bit of a shock. I was not looking forward to this movie, and that almost exclusively has to do with my reaction to the past 3 movies in Sony's Spider-Man universe, and they are Venom, Let There Be Carnage and Morbius. None of those movies I would generally say were good in any way. There's a couple of moments, there's a couple of aspects of those films that I don't mind, but generally overall I don't find them very good and I'm not entertained by them. I genuinely don't know how the Spider-Verse movies are made by the same company. And plus, when it comes to the characters that Sony Pictures are choosing to get the big budget movie treatment, Madam Web seems like a really strange choice. I do like Madam Web overall. I do think that she's a really fun, entertaining character. I do think that she is a great addition to the Spider-Man universe. I'd love to see her be integrated into the MCU. I'd love to see her be integrated into the Spider-Verse movies. But headlining her own movie? I don't know. I've always said if you're going to do a Madam Web related project, I reckon that what you should do is focus on telling a TV series and have it be an anthology series in the style of like What If, where you've got each episode focusing on a different universe, a different Spider-Verse if you will. And Madam Web is the narrator actually going through all these different universes and you're able to see all these different interpretations through her. That to me would work as a Madam Web project, but a standalone movie, it depends what it is that they're doing. The casting of Dakota Johnson as Madam Web certainly raised a few eyebrows, plus the set pictures that we were seeing weren't really inspiring a lot of confidence. And then the trailers were released and they did absolutely nothing to gain any sort of excitement whatsoever for this project. But for all we knew, this movie could be a sleeper hit. This could be one of the best movies of the year. And then the reviews were released and they were way worse than I thought they were going to be. The movie at the time of me recording this video currently sits at 13% on Rotten Tomatoes, which is actually lower than Morbius. I didn't think that would be possible. And then to add to that is the writing credits for 2 of the screenwriters that worked on Madam Web include movies such as Gods of Egypt, Power Rangers 2017, The Last Witch Hunter, Dracula Untold, and Morbius. So yeah, I definitely wasn't looking forward to seeing this movie, but there was a little part of me that was hoping that this would be one of those movies that was so bad that it's actually good or at least fun in some way. And it's really not. Madam Web is an origin story and follows a younger Madam Web than the one that most people, including me, are used to seeing. And throughout the movie, we see Cassandra Webb gaining her clairvoyance abilities and trying to figure out how they work. But she becomes embroiled in a game of cat and mouse as a mysterious stranger from her past called Ezekiel Sims targets 3 young women who are all destined to one day become superheroes. The story basically feels like a combination of both the Terminator and Groundhog Day, but it's all done with Spider-Man related characters. But unlike those movies, it doesn't resonate with you on an emotional level like Groundhog Day, and neither does it have the suspense of the Terminator. It does have some good ideas and it does have some interesting concepts, but the overall execution of it is a bit messy. And I feel like a large part of the reason for that is due to the editing style that this movie has gone for, because the editing for this movie is all over the place. I get what it is that they are going for, because this is a character that is able to basically have a vision of the future and you see little flashes of what it is that Cassandra can see. But a lot of the times it does make it a little bit harder to follow, because there are times where it does kind of follow the vision but you're not aware that it's a vision, and the next thing you know something bad happens and it suddenly goes back to where she was before she started having the vision, and you're just like, wait, hang on, what? So it can be a movie that is a little bit hard to keep up with at times. It does move quite quick, but it also can be quite slow at the same time. It's a bit of a weird mix. And I feel like that's part of the reason why this movie doesn't really have any sort of tension or suspense, because you're never quite sure if you actually are watching a vision or if you actually are watching what's happening. The story itself does feel fairly straightforward, but it's the editing style that does make it a lot more complicated animated than it actually is. It also doesn't help that it does feel like there are a few scenes that are missing in this. I mean, all of the movies within Sony's Spider-Man universe do feel like they have been either reshot in some areas or just had things completely removed or changed. And that's no different here. I know for 100% fact that there are other scenes that are supposed to be in this movie, like that infamous line that went viral online.
Ezekiel Sims. He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died.
That line isn't even in the movie, but it's all over the trailers. Plus, leading up to the release of this movie, it was rumoured online that once again that Sony Pictures had actually gone through this movie and removed any potential references to both Spider-Man or Venom. Because as far as I know, this movie was intended to be a part of the Venomverse movies, but up until the last minute they decided to kind of change it so that it was completely set within its own universe. So if you are going into this movie expecting connections to the other movies, you are going to be disappointed because this is very much a standalone film. The runtime for this movie is just under 2 hours long, and it's actually the longest movie out of all 4 of the Sony Spider-Man Universe movies. But as I said, it definitely does feel like it has been trimmed down in some areas. It does feel like there are some scenes or some sequences that might have either been trimmed or cut in some way, and you definitely can feel it. Especially when it comes to naming characters that you might know, it jumps around all over the place and does everything it can to make sure that you don't actually hear any names. I don't know why. Anyway, when it comes to the cast that are featured in this movie, there's some very mixed performances overall, and leading things as Cassandra Webb is Dakota Johnson. Dakota Johnson is definitely not the first choice that I think most people will have in mind when they think of Madam Web. I think most people would have tilted towards somebody like Helen Mirren, but I was curious to see what direction it was that they were going to go with her. This is intended to be the younger version of Cassandra Webb. She does exist in the comic books, but I do think that most people do recognise her more as the elderly lady in the wheelchair with the web behind her and the blindfold. So seeing a younger version of Madam Web running around the streets of New York in a red leather jacket and working full-time as a paramedic, it's definitely a choice. Madam Web has always been quite a mysterious character in both the comic books and the 90s animated series. That's where I was first introduced to her, and I always thought she was awesome. So doing a movie all about her origin story can be quite interesting, and I do think that the ideas that they could have potentially done, I do think could have been really interesting. There could have been a really great idea for her as a character, but I don't think that it actually works. And on top of that, it does take away a lot of the mystery around her character. And in terms of how it is that Dakota Johnson goes about performing as this character, I don't think that she really comes across as the most likeable character overall. I don't know whether that's just the performance or the script. Because bear in mind, this is a character that is meant to be protecting these 3 young women from this psychotic killer that's coming after them. And there are multiple times where she either just goes like, look, this isn't my problem, I'm just going to drop you off with your parents, or she just straight up dumps them and goes somewhere else. And that includes one sequence where she just kind of drops them off to be looked after, and then she goes, right, well, I need to figure out what's going on, and then she just goes off to Peru. And this is midway through the movie. I do think that it is a mistake actually having her physically travelling to Peru and going and doing everything that she needs to do. Personally, I think that it would have worked so much better, and I was led to believe, based on all the marketing, that it was going to be a vision. That would make a lot more sense, and it wouldn't distract from what's actually going on. I do think that Dakota Johnson's performance is okay overall. I do think that she does have quite a dry sense of humour. I don't know how much of it is actually her or not. Based on what I've seen of her during a lot of the interviews behind the scenes and stuff, it does feel like it is very much her. There are some moments where it does feel like she's a bit disconnected from what's actually going on. There are some big life-changing moments for Cassandra Webb in this movie, and there's almost no reaction from Dakota whatsoever. Plus, there is this sequence where they do try to have this big emotional moment with Cassandra Webb, but to me, it just doesn't feel earned. But as I said, I definitely think that it is the script that is the issue more than anything else. And in terms of how the clairvoyancy is actually portrayed in this movie, I think that there are some interesting ideas and interesting visuals that they do try and go with. I do think that there are some interesting concepts. But as I said, it does kind of take away from a lot of the tension that is going on, because you basically are seeing what is about to happen, but you're never quite sure whether it is actually really happening or if it is just a vision. But as I said, Dakota Johnson is okay overall. The performance itself is so-so at times, but I definitely think that the overall direction that they go with her character could have been a little bit better and a little bit more resonant emotionally. But as for some of the other main characters that appear in this movie, we have a trio of teens who will one day become superheroes with their own set of spider powers. And they are Mattie Franklin, played by Celeste O'Connor, Anya Corazon, played by Isabella Merced, and Sydney Sweeney playing Julia Cornwell. Not Julia Carpenter. Yeah, for some reason they decided to change Julia Carpenter's name to Julia Cornwell in this movie. I don't really know why. I think when it comes to the casting choices for these characters, I think that overall it does work for the most part, and I do feel like each of the three actresses are doing the best that they can with these roles. But in terms of how much of a contribution that these characters actually have to the overall story, they don't really do that much. The movie and the story that it is focusing on is completely centred around Cassandra Webb. It is her story. It is all about her character, her origin story. So it does feel like these three characters do kind of get pushed to the side, which I do feel is a bit of a shame, because I do think that all three of these characters could be really good and really interesting if they are given enough time to breathe. There are a few moments in this movie where they do try and develop these characters a little bit more. There are a few scenes where they do actually leave these characters on their own, and it gives them time to bond, to get to know each other, and just kind of let their hair down a little. And while I feel like that is definitely something that is needed for this movie, I do feel like it does kind of feel a little bit rushed. I do feel like the actual development of their relationship to one another is quite fast. And also, and I completely understand, yes, these are meant to be teenagers at the end of the day, but some of the decisions that they make are pretty stupid, especially when you have a killer coming after you. But overall, I do feel like the characterizations of these three characters do feel a bit underdeveloped. I do feel like there is definitely a lot of missed opportunities with them. I do think that they do kind of come across as a bit bland, and I definitely feel like they could have done a lot more with them. And unfortunately, that is a running theme when it comes to a lot of the other characters that do appear in this movie. We do have appearances from actors such as Adam Scott as well as Emma Roberts, but again, the characters that they are playing do come across as a bit bland. And I don't know whether it's the editing, the script, or a mixture of both, but there is definitely a lack of chemistry with a lot of these characters. The dialogue and the deliveries of that dialogue, as many other reviewers have said, is very unnatural, and it is really clunky as well. It's genuinely funny when some of these lines are actually delivered, because this just doesn't feel like anything that a normal human being would actually say. This actually does feel like it was generated by AI. So I definitely understand that joke that Dakota Johnson came out with on SNL, I think it was, where she basically said that this movie feels like if AI wrote your boyfriend's perfect movie. The dialogue is unnecessarily expositional. It is so heavy-handed at times. They have to describe everything that is happening. They can't ever just leave anything to just visuals or character interactions or character moments or anything like that, and it makes it feel very staged. It makes it feel very puppet mastery, where you've got somebody basically like controlling it and saying, no, you have to say it this way, you have to pause here, you have to say this line here, you have to do this. It just doesn't feel real, and it is definitely distracting, and that absolutely applies to the main antagonist of this movie, and that character is somebody called Ezekiel Sims. Ezekiel is played by Tahar Rahim, and his character, like every other character in this movie, is just bland. He's just a bad guy doing bad guy things. There is definitely a motivation behind why it is that he is doing what he is doing, and I do feel like if they actually did kind of explore that a little bit more, actually sort of give him a bit more conflict, I feel like that would have made him a lot more interesting. But of course they don't do any of that, so he does come across as very two-dimensional, and they really could have done so much more with him. I mean, they pretty much lay out his plan almost step for step, because there is actually a sequence where he does explain everything that he is doing, to the point where he goes into so much detail about it that it is genuinely just like, you don't need to say all this, we can figure it out on our own. It's not that complicated either, because essentially his entire motivation is he has a dream about these three characters coming after him in the future as their superhero selves and stopping him, so he wants to basically make sure that they don't become superheroes. But he seems to go through more increasingly violent methods to actually get them to the point where there are so many people who get killed because he comes after them, which never actually gets mentioned or addressed or anything, because he actually does have a partner who is actually helping him, who is basically like helping him track the girls across the city, and there's never any resistance or anything, you know, something that could have actually made this a little bit more interesting. She just goes with it. Anyway, I don't mind the performance from Tahar Rahim. I do think that he is okay in the role overall, but again, a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the deliveries that he has to give in this movie do feel very controlled and very staged. And I know I seem to bring this up pretty much every single time I talk about a movie these days, but the ADR that they use in this movie, oh my god, it is awful. For the most part, it's absolutely fine. There's no problems whatsoever, but a lot of the scenes with Ezekiel, which is where it's most prominent, there are scenes where it is so obvious that he is not actually saying what he is mouthing. And it's not even like a subtle thing, like it's not like over his shoulder or anything, you can like just about see his mouth over his shoulder or anything like that. No. There are scenes where he is like right up close in camera, and he is not saying what is actually what you can hear. It's almost on the same level as Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze. It's winter forever here in Gotham. He doesn't say that at all.
It's winter forever here in Gotham.
He's not a fun character. He's not entertaining. He is just the bad guy. And this is one of the very, very rare times that I will actually say this, but Morbius did it better. Milo in that movie, played by Matt Smith, was way more fun and way more entertaining than Ezekiel is in this movie. I really wish that they had done a lot more with Ezekiel in this movie. I do think that he is an interesting character. I do think that the concept behind him is really interesting, but they barely do anything actually interesting with him. But the one positive that I will say about Ezekiel in this movie is that I don't actually mind the costume. It's basically just a black Spider-Man suit with like a blood red webbing design all across it and around the eyes. I've seen a lot of people online basically saying that Ezekiel's costume in this movie looks like something that the boys would make as a parody of Spider-Man, and I can't unsee it. It's just so accurate. Ezekiel is the only character who actually does wear his costume throughout the movie. He's the only character who actually does sort of feel like he is something out of a superhero film. All of the other characters are in just like normal civilian gear, and that's really it. There is a grounded nature that they are trying to strive for with this movie, with S.J. Clarkson working on this movie. Her background, for those who aren't aware, she worked on Jessica Jones and The Defenders, and both of those series were very grounded and set within reality. So when I found out that she was attached to this movie and I saw the set pictures and the costumes that these characters were wearing, I did get the vibe that it was that they were going for. So for pretty much most of the runtime, they are only in their civilian gear. But when it comes to the actual superhero costumes and the overall design that they have gone for with these costumes, I do think that overall they do look really good. For the entire 2 minutes that they're on screen. Probably not even that. Yeah, for a movie that does boast 4 different superheroes and use their superhero costumes in a ton of the marketing to the point where there are posters of all 4 of them in costumes. Those costumes are barely in it. Almost to the point where I did kind of wonder why it was that they actually showed those sequences in the trailer, because that is basically it. Which for somebody who actually does like seeing these characters in their comic accurate costumes is very disappointing. I feel like it would have been so much better if they actually hadn't revealed that those costumes actually are featured in the movie. I think that it would have been a much bigger surprise if they were left out the marketing altogether. But I understand that this is a superhero movie and they do need to advertise these characters as their comic accurate counterparts. But once again, it does feel like Sony Pictures are basically trying to advertise this movie as something that it isn't. Which ironically is what happened to the actors. Yeah, a little fun story about what's been going on behind the scenes. Apparently what it actually sounds like is when these actresses were actually pitched this movie, it was basically sold to them as just a Marvel movie, but they weren't actually filled in on whether it was part of the MCU or whether it was completely its own thing. Now, I don't know about every single person who is in this movie, but I know Dakota Johnson and Sydney Sweeney have both openly talked about joining the MCU and being a part of that world. And I think that definitely explains why it was that Dakota Johnson kind of just seems like she's just kind of given up with any sort of passion about this movie during all those interviews. I do think that all of the performers in this movie would be great additions to the MCU. It just depends on which characters it is that they're actually playing. Anyway, but yeah, I do think that for the 2 minutes that these costumes are featured on screen, I do think that for the most part, I do actually quite like the designs that they have gone for. They do feel very comic accurate. The only thing I would really change about some of the costumes is just the lenses. I would prefer the white bug eyes, but that's just one minor nitpick. I do think that they have translated them very well. I'm a bit 50-50 on Madam Web's costume. I do think that the overall colour design, the overall sort of pattern that they've gone for it, doesn't look too bad. But personally, if I was choosing a Madam Web costume to adapt for live action, I would go more towards what it is that they did in the 94 animated series and go for that costume instead, because I feel like most Spider-Man fans see that version of Madam Web as the definitive version. I personally have a soft spot for the one that is featured in the Shattered Dimensions game, but I will admit that the 94 look I do think is a little bit more iconic. So yeah, the costumes are okay, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of them. But as I said, the movie is trying to keep this grounded tone and nature to it, which it does mostly kind of do, but then it does get very over the top, especially during the third act. But for the most part, it does try and keep things as realistic as possible, despite the fact that you have Ezekiel who's able to do all these incredible things. But unfortunately, there is a lack of action in this movie. There are a few chase sequences, there is like a bit of a scuffle here and there, but that's really it. And as I said, because of the way that the movie is edited together and you're never quite sure if something is a vision or if it's actually really happening, it does mean that there is a lack of tension. I really want to be on the edge of my seat when Ezekiel shows up and he potentially is going to kill these characters, but there's none of that because I don't know if it's actually happening. The movie does try and give you a bit of a jolt every so often. There are a few sequences that I would say are quite close to jump scares, but it's mostly just like flashes across screen and just like loud noises, so there's nothing really too jumpy. And plus you can see most of it coming a mile off, so it doesn't really work. But I will admit though, the fact that they do try and keep this grounded, it does mean that they try and do as much for real as they can. There is definitely a lot of wire work, there is a lot of stunt work that has gone into this. It's not fantastic, but I do think that there is some creativity on display, especially when it comes to the cinematography and and some of the camera movements that they do use throughout this movie, because there are some very interesting angles and techniques that they do use, especially during some of those action sequences where you've got Ezekiel like jumping up onto a roof and then the camera like flips around with him. That's actually pretty cool. They do use a lot of shots like that where the camera just like follows someone, it like goes along and pans and twists and all sorts. It does look okay. But then there's other times where the camera movement is just really random and it doesn't really work for what it is that they are trying to do on screen, because there's actually quite a tense sequence, or supposedly a tense sequence, quite early on. And there's these two characters having this exchange and it keeps cutting between what it is that these characters are doing, their reactions when they're talking. But for some reason the camera movements are just all over the place. It's like it sort of like stays on them, but then it sort of like is moving around, and then it sort of like pushes in and then it pulls out and then it's like twisting and all sorts, and it's just like, why is this happening? It just comes across as awkward and I don't understand that decision. But other than that, it is okay. Unlike the CGI, my God, it is not good in this movie. Like, I knew that it wasn't going to be good going into it. I kept hearing about the bad CGI in this movie and I kept thinking, it can't be that bad. And then I saw it, and especially early on in the movie, and there's like people jumping off the trees and moving around and all sorts, and it just looks awful. And Sony Pictures, I would normally say, do actually have some pretty good effects work. So I don't understand what happened here. I've said it before and I'll say it again, it is absolutely not the artist's fault. I think the art style, I think that the actual designs of things don't look too bad. I think how they handled the web and all the sort of visions that Madam Web have, I do think look a bit cartoony, but at the same time I do think the actual designs of them actually not too bad. I definitely would have gone for something a little bit more colourful and a little bit more trippy, like something along the lines of like the Dark Dimension in Doctor Strange. But I think that it's okay for what it is in this movie. But yeah, overall the CG in this movie is just not good. And when it comes to the soundtrack by Johann Soderqvist, I think that it is fine overall. It does sound nice, it does fit the movie, it does fit the style and tone, but it isn't memorable. There isn't really any themes that I can really remember. I have tried listening to the soundtrack on its own and I can't really recall that much about it. It is okay overall, but I will say for this kind of movie, it does feel quite generic. But also, this movie does actually feature quite a few songs from the early 2000s. For those who aren't aware, this movie takes place in 2003. So a lot of the songs that they do feature in this movie are songs that came out around about that time. I don't mind the songs that they do use in this movie. I do think that how they are used is quite fun. I don't think that they all completely fit within each scene, but it does liven things up a little bit and it does bring back memories of the early 2000s. And speaking of things that don't really fit in this movie is the very heavy-handed product placement. There are so many scenes in this movie where there are products that are just so prominently on screen that it's just so obvious that that's what's going on. Then the biggest culprit is actually Pepsi, because there's just so many Pepsi references throughout this. I suppose it makes a change from Coca-Cola, but yeah, overall it's just a bit much. Overall, I really didn't enjoy this movie. It's messy, bland, and while I don't think it's as bad as Fantastic and it didn't frustrate me as much as Morbius did, which is really saying something, I would agree that this is one of the worst Marvel-related films that we've had in years. It's not absolutely awful. There are a few things that I don't mind, like the cast, the costume designs, some of the cinematography, the ideas and concepts were pretty interesting, and the music was okay too. But the characters are not properly developed, the dialogue is clunky and strange, the rest of the cinematography is awkward, the editing is just all over the place, the CG is really not good, and there is a significant lack of tension and suspense or even fun. If it does sound interesting to you, then give it a go. You might completely disagree with me and have an absolute ball with this movie, and that is absolutely fine. But other than that, I can't recommend this movie, and I don't think that I'll be revisiting it anytime soon either. The movie, unfortunately, is one to forget. So with all that being said, my rating for Madam Web is 4 out of 10. As I said, I'm not a fan of Sony's Spider-Man universe. I do want these movies to be better, but based on the increasingly bad reception that these movies have been getting, things are not looking good for either Kraven the Hunter or Venom 3. They're actually making a third Venom movie. I genuinely want these movies to be good, but everything that I have seen from these past 4 movies, it does not give me a lot of confidence. So we'll see what happens. Well, that is pretty much everything I want to say for this video, so if you have watched this video, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe, and be sure to hit the notification button to keep up to date on everything that is going on here. If you have seen Madam Web, and it absolutely does not sound like a lot of you have, I mean seriously, when I booked my tickets to go and see this movie, up until about 3 days before the film was actually released, my cinema screen was completely empty apart from me. On the day that the movie came out, the cinema was actually a lot more full than I thought it was going to be, but up until that 3-day mark, I genuinely thought that I was going to be seeing this movie on my own. Let me know down in the comments what you think about it, plus if you have any suggestions for any future Rewind reviews you would like to see me do, let me know down below. But until next time, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. See you guys.